Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the morning light come through the oak trees, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real, quiet, unshakable peace. But to understand how I got there, you need to know where I was 18 months ago. You need to know what my son's wife did to me. And you need to know what my late husband left inside that old metal toolbox in the garage. The one nobody thought to look inside for 32 years. My name is Margaret. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years married to a good man named Harold, raising our son Daniel in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee. Harold worked as a mechanical engineer. Quiet, methodical, careful with everything. His tools, his words, his love. He passed away from a heart attack 11 years ago, and I have missed him every single day since. Daniel was 22 when his father died. I watched him grieve, and I grieved alongside him. I thought that shared loss had bonded us in a way nothing could undo. I was wrong about that. For 6 years after Harold passed, I lived alone in that house on Clover Ridge Road. I kept the garden Harold planted. I kept his workbench in the garage exactly as he'd left it. I volunteered twice a week at the church thrift store. I had my routines, my neighbors, my church friends. I had a life, modest and mine. Then Daniel met Renee. She was 34 when they married, sharp-eyed and quick with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself this was just what mothers feel when their sons bring home someone new. I tried. I made dinners. I remembered her birthday. I gave them a generous check at the wedding and another when they bought their house in Nashville. For the first 2 years, things were merely uncomfortable. Holidays were tense. My calls to Daniel got shorter. He stopped dropping by on weekends the way he used to. I understood that newlyweds needed space. I truly did. I just didn't understand that space was being carefully managed by someone who had decided very early on that I was a problem to be solved. The first sign I missed was the Christmas I drove down to Nashville, and Renee had put my gifts in the guest room closet, unopened, and replaced them under the tree with gifts she bought herself, tagged with my name. I only found out because little Maya, their daughter, told me innocently over breakfast. "Grandma, Mommy said your presents weren't nice enough." I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. The second sign I missed was when Daniel called me, voice careful and rehearsed, to tell me that they were thinking about simplifying for the holidays going forward. Fewer gatherings, less travel. I said, of course, whatever works for your family. I didn't realize then that I was being slowly removed from the definition of his family. By the time I understood what was happening, it had already happened. It was a Thursday in March when Daniel drove up to Knoxville alone. I was happy to see him. I made coffee. I got out the good cups. He sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done homework as a boy, where Harold and I had eaten 10,000 meals, and he looked at the wall instead of at me. He told me that Renee felt the house was too big for one person. He told me they'd been looking into some options. He told me there was a very nice place in Brentwood, a senior living community, with activities and a dining hall and medical staff on call. He said it would be better for me, safer. I asked him if this was what he wanted or what Renee wanted. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said they both agreed it was the right thing. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment. It wasn't just hurt. It was a kind of vertigo, like the floor had dropped 6 inches without warning. This was my child. This was the boy I had nursed through every fever, driven to every practice, held while he sobbed at his father's graveside. And he was sitting at my kitchen table reading from a script someone else had written, telling me it was time for me to go. I said I needed time to think about it. He said they'd already put a deposit down. The move-in date was in 6 weeks. I didn't cry in front of him. I walked him to the door. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, and then I sat back down at my kitchen table. And I stared at Harold's coffee mug, the old blue one, chipped on the handle, that I'd never been able to throw away. And I thought, Harold, I don't know what to do. 6 weeks. I had 6 weeks to pack up 31 years. Renee came up 2 weeks later to help. She walked through my house with the focused energy of someone taking inventory. She touched things. She picked up Harold's mother's ceramic lamp and turned it over to check the bottom. She stood in the doorway of the garage for a long time. I watched her, and I felt something cold move through me. She told me the house would sell faster if it were staged. She told me most of my furniture was too old to bring to Brentwood. The rooms were small. It wouldn't fit. She had already called an estate sale company. They could come Saturday. I said I hadn't agreed to sell the house. She smiled that smile of hers and said Daniel would explain everything later. I want you to understand something about that moment. I am not a woman who raises her voice. I am not a woman who makes scenes. Harold always said I had a long fuse and a clear head, and he meant it as a compliment. But standing in my own hallway, watching my daughter-in-law mentally price out my life, something shifted in me. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more durable than anger. A decision. I said very calmly that I would need a few days alone to go through Harold's things in the garage. Personal items. She could schedule the estate sale for the following weekend. She looked slightly annoyed, but agreed. That night, alone, I went into Harold's garage. I hadn't truly gone through it since he died. I'd kept it clean, dusted, organized the way he'd left it. His tools hung on their pegboard outlines. His workbench was clear. Everything in its place, the way Harold liked. I stood in the middle of that space, and I breathed in the smell of motor oil and wood shavings and something that was just him. And I started to cry. Not the polite kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below language. When I finally stopped, I started going through things methodically. Harold's toolbox, the big red rolling one, I'd already looked through. His fishing equipment, his woodworking supplies. In the back corner, up on the top shelf behind a row of paint cans, there was an old metal military surplus box, olive green, dented on one corner, with a small combination lock that had rusted nearly shut. I hadn't thought about that box in years. Harold had brought it with him when we moved into the house. When I'd asked about it once, he'd said it was just old paperwork from before we met. I'd never pushed. I found the lock had rusted enough that it opened with just pressure. No combination needed anymore. Inside, under a layer of folded cloth, was a manila envelope, a leather document wallet, and a small tape recorder, the old cassette kind, with a piece of masking tape on it in Harold's handwriting. The tape said, "For Margaret, when the time is right." I sat down on the cold concrete floor right there, and I held that tape recorder for a long time before I could make myself press play. Harold's voice came out of that little speaker, and the sound of it after 11 years of silence hit me somewhere behind the sternum. He sounded younger than I remembered. He said he'd recorded this not long after Daniel was born because he wanted to make sure, if anything ever happened to him, that I would know the whole picture. He told me that before we met, in his late 20s, he had spent 3 years working as a design engineer for a company called Tulliver Industrial in Cincinnati. During that time, he had quietly developed, on his own time, a series of mechanical patents, 6 in total, related to a type of vibration-dampening coupling used in industrial machinery. He had filed them independently. He had kept them. He said the patents had been generating small amounts of royalty income for years, routed through a small holding account he'd set up, because the technology had been licensed to a manufacturer in Ohio. He said by the time he made the recording, the account had about $40,000 in it. He said he'd never mentioned it because he'd always meant to surprise me with it for retirement, and then somehow the right time never came. And then he'd gotten sick for a while in his early 50s, and he'd wanted to make sure I knew where to find everything, in case something happened. He said the patents would expire eventually, but the royalties would keep coming until they did. He said the account information and the contact for the patent attorney was in the leather wallet. He said he loved me. He said he was sorry if he'd been too quiet about the things that mattered. He said I deserved every good thing. I sat on that concrete floor for a long time after the tape ended. Then I opened the leather wallet. The account, when I finally contacted the bank the next morning, did not have $40,000 in it. It had $287,000 in it, 11 years of royalties accumulating quietly in an account no one knew existed, in a name that was solely mine as the named beneficiary on Harold's estate documents. I need to tell you about the phone call with the patent attorney, a woman named Carol Dreyfus, whose office was in Columbus, Ohio. I had called expecting to untangle some small bureaucratic knot. What she told me, in a voice of careful professional calm, was that 2 of Harold's 6 patents had been sublicensed the previous year to a large European manufacturing conglomerate. The royalty structure had changed significantly. The account would continue receiving payments for another 11 years at a rate considerably higher than before. She quoted me a figure for the projected total. I had to ask her to repeat it. I wrote it down on the back of a church bulletin that was sitting on Harold's workbench. I sat with that number and I thought about Renee standing in my hallway with that inventory smile. I thought about Daniel reading from his script at my kitchen table. I thought about the deposit they'd already put down on a room in Brentwood. I thought about Harold's voice on that tape saying, "I wanted to make sure you would know the whole picture." I called my own attorney the next morning. Her name was Beverly Marsh, and she'd handled Harold's original estate. I told her everything. I brought her the documents. She spent 2 days reviewing them, and then she called me back and said, very simply, "Margaret, you are in an extremely strong position. I want to be fair to my son. I do not believe Daniel is a cruel man. I believe he is a man who has spent years being slowly convinced by someone very skilled at convincing people of things. I believe he genuinely thought he was doing what was best for me. I believe he didn't ask enough questions about whose idea it really was, or why it had to happen so fast, or why the estate sale needed to happen before the house was even officially listed. But I also believe that love is not only a feeling. Love is also a practice, and in the practice of it, my son had failed me. Beverly sent a letter to Daniel and Renee on a Wednesday. I was not there to see them read it. But Daniel called me that evening, and he sounded like a man who had been turned upside down and slowly put back on his feet. The letter outlined, with great clarity, several things. That the family home on Clover Ridge Road was solely in my name and would remain so until I chose otherwise. That the estate sale scheduled for the upcoming weekend was canceled. That any further attempts to manage, direct, or facilitate the disposal of my property without my written consent would be treated as a legal matter. That I had retained full and independent counsel and intended to manage my own affairs going forward. There was more. Beverly had also discovered, in going through Harold's records, that Renee had at some point obtained Daniel's power of attorney and had already been in contact with a real estate agent about Clover Ridge Road, without my knowledge, without my consent. Beverly used the phrase potential elder financial abuse twice in the letter, which under Tennessee law carries serious implications. Renee did not call me. Daniel called 3 times in 2 days. The first call, he was defensive. The second call, he was quiet in a different way. The third call, he cried. I let him cry. I didn't rush him. When he was done, I said, "Daniel, I need you to understand something. What almost happened to me was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan. And I need you to decide what kind of man you are going to be about it." He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood the full picture. I said, "Your father always believed in the full picture. I did not move to Brentwood. I stayed in my house on Clover Ridge Road. In the months that followed, I used part of Harold's account to do things I had been quietly wanting to do for years. I fixed the back porch properly. Harold had always meant to get to it. I had the oak floors refinished. I set up a small scholarship fund at the county high school in Harold's name for students going into engineering. I sent a check to the church thrift store where I volunteered, large enough that they could finally replace the industrial shelving unit that had been held together with bungee cords for 6 years. I also hired a family therapist, not for myself alone. I told Daniel that if he wanted a relationship with me, we would do it with someone in the room who could help us both say the things we didn't know how to say. He agreed. It has been hard. It has been worth it. Renee did not come to the first 3 sessions. She came to the 4th. She sat across from me with her hands in her lap, and she looked, for the first time in 5 years, like a person rather than a strategy. We are not close. I do not expect us to be. But Daniel is in my kitchen now on Sunday afternoons the way he used to be, and Maya calls me on the phone to tell me about her school projects, and that is more than I had 8 months ago. Harold's toolbox still hangs in the garage. His workbench is still exactly as he left it. But now there's something new on the shelf where the old military box used to sit. A framed photograph of Harold and me at Klingman's Dome, the summer before Daniel was born. We're squinting into the sun and laughing at something neither of us can probably remember anymore. I look at it every time I go out there. I think about what he knew and what he kept quietly, patiently, for the right moment. I think about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself, but just stays. Solid and present, and there when you need it. I am 63 years old. I have a house I own outright and a back porch where the light comes through the oak trees in the morning. I have a grandson who calls me on Saturdays and asks me to tell him about the old days. I have my church, my garden, my neighbors, and a photograph of a young woman laughing on a mountain with the best man she ever knew. I have the full picture. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, or if someone you love has tried to convince you that what's yours isn't really yours, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what the story brought up for you. I read every single word. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who has been made to feel smaller than she is, please share this video with her. She might need to be reminded that the people who love us sometimes leave us more than we know. We just have to know where to look. I'll see you in the next one.